The airport buzzed with activity as travelers rushed to catch their flights. Among them was Thomas Wilson, a 62-year-old retired Army sergeant with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes that had seen more of the world than most. His military service cap sat proudly on his head, decorated with pins that told stories of his 30 years protecting his country. Today wasn't going well for Thomas. His first flight had been delayed, forcing him to sprint across the Atlanta airport to catch his connecting flight to Los Angeles. By the time he boarded the plane, sweat beaded on his forehead, and his bad knee, an old war injury, throbbed with pain. Last call for boarding, the announcement echoed as Thomas made his way down the narrow aisle, pulling his carry-on behind him. The flight was packed, and he could feel the impatient stares of already seated passengers. "Excuse me," he said politely to a young mother as he squeezed past her row. His seat was near the back, and the overhead bins were filling up fast. Thomas spotted an empty space above his assigned seat and attempted to lift his bag. His arms, once strong enough to carry wounded comrades across battlefields, now struggled with the weight. The bag slipped slightly in his grip as he tried to push it into the compartment. "Come on, mister, we don't have all day," muttered a businessman behind him, checking his watch dramatically. "Sorry about that," Thomas replied with a patient smile. "Just need a second here." That's when it happened. A flight attendant with blonde hair pulled into a tight bun appeared beside him. Her name tag read Patricia. Her face was fixed in a scowl, eyes darting between Thomas and her watch. Without warning, Patricia shoved past him, her elbow connecting with his shoulder with enough force to make him stumble backward. Thomas grabbed the seat to steady himself, his veteran's cap nearly falling off his head. "Some people just don't know how to travel," Patricia said loudly, not bothering to lower her voice. "This is exactly why we announce boarding times." The surrounding passengers fell silent. A middle-aged woman across the aisle gasped quietly. A teenage boy looked up from his phone, eyes wide with shock. Thomas straightened himself, adjusted his cap, and took a deep breath. In his years of service, he'd faced far worse than a rude flight attendant. Without a word, he carefully placed his bag under the seat in front of him instead and settled into his place by the window. "Sir, are you okay?" whispered the woman sitting next to him, concern evident in her voice. "I'm fine, thank you," Thomas replied with dignity. "Been through rougher landings than that." His smile was genuine, but his eyes held a hint of sadness. Patricia continued down the aisle, not once looking back at the man she just shoved. She laughed with another crew member at the front of the plane, occasionally glancing toward Thomas's section with what looked like irritation. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Thomas pulled out his phone and looked at a photo of a young man in an expensive suit standing next to a movie poster. His thumb gently brushed across the screen before he turned the phone off and placed it in his pocket. The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing their departure for Los Angeles. Thomas closed his eyes and leaned back in his seat. The 6-hour flight stretched ahead of him, and he already knew it wouldn't be pleasant. Little did Patricia know that this seemingly ordinary veteran was far from ordinary, and their brief encounter would soon turn her world upside down. The plane lifted off the ground, carrying with it not just passengers, but the beginning of a story that would change multiple lives forever. The plane leveled off at cruising altitude, the seatbelt sign dinged off, and passengers began to settle in for the long flight ahead. Thomas adjusted his seat slightly, wincing as his knee protested the movement. The medication for his old war injury was in his carry-on, tucked under the seat in front of him, along with a small bottle of water that was now empty. Patricia pushed the beverage cart down the aisle, offering drinks and snacks to passengers with practiced efficiency. Her customer service smile appeared and disappeared like clockwork as she moved from row to row. That is, until she reached Thomas's section. As if by magic, her eyes seemed to look straight through him. She handed drinks to the woman beside Thomas and the man across the aisle, then began to move her cart forward without a word. "Excuse me," Thomas said politely, raising his hand slightly. "Could I please have some water?" "I need to take medication." Patricia's shoulders stiffened. Without turning fully toward him, she replied, "I'll come back," and continued pushing her cart forward. 20 minutes passed. She never returned. An elderly woman sitting across the aisle noticed what happened. She leaned over and whispered, "Here, take mine." I haven't opened it yet. She handed Thomas her bottled water with a sympathetic smile. Thank you, ma'am. That's very kind, Thomas said, the corners of his eyes crinkling with genuine gratitude. He took his pills and settled back, pulling out his phone. His weathered fingers, once steady enough to disarm explosives in the field, now gently swiped through photos. His face softened as he looked at pictures of a young man in expensive suits standing next to celebrities, on red carpets, and behind large movie cameras. In one photo, the young man, clearly his son, had his arm around Thomas's shoulders, both of them grinning widely in front of what appeared to be a movie studio entrance. Patricia passed by again, this time collecting trash. Once more, she skipped Thomas's row entirely. But as she moved down the aisle, something caught her eye. The gold watch on Thomas's wrist gleamed under the cabin lights. A luxury brand that cost more than she made in 3 months. His shoes, too, were handcrafted Italian leather, and his simple button-up shirt, though unassuming, was clearly tailored to fit his still athletic frame perfectly. For the first time, doubt flickered across Patricia's face. She glanced back at Thomas, her brow furrowed slightly. The veteran she had dismissed as just another difficult passenger suddenly didn't fit her assumptions. But pride is a powerful thing, and apologizing now would mean admitting she'd been wrong, something Patricia rarely did. Instead, she straightened her uniform and continued her duties, though her eyes kept drifting back to Thomas's row. 2 hours into the flight, a young boy walking back from the bathroom stopped next to Thomas's seat. "Are you really a soldier?" the boy asked, pointing to the pins on Thomas's cap that he placed on the empty middle seat. Thomas smiled warmly. "I was son for 30 years. Did you fight in wars?" "I did, 3 of them." The boy's eyes widened with admiration. "Were you scared?" "Every single day," Thomas answered honestly. "But being brave isn't about not feeling scared. It's about doing what needs to be done even when you are scared." Patricia passed by just in time to hear this exchange. She slowed her pace, listening as Thomas patiently answered the boy's questions with stories that were both appropriate for young ears, yet didn't sugarcoat the realities of service. "My grandpa was in the army too," the boy said proudly. "Then your grandpa is a hero," Thomas replied, his voice carrying the weight of someone who truly understood what that meant. The boy's mother called him back to his seat, and Thomas returned to looking out the window at the clouds below. But something had changed in the cabin. Other passengers who had witnessed Patricia's earlier behavior now looked at Thomas with newfound respect, and at Hannah with barely concealed disapproval. Patricia felt their stares like physical pressure. For the first time since the incident during boarding, uncertainty crept into her mind. Who exactly was this man she had shoved? And why did she have the nagging feeling she had made a terrible mistake? The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing they would begin their descent to Los Angeles in 20 minutes. Thomas checked his watch, the same gold timepiece that had caught Patricia's attention earlier. The flight had been long, made longer by the uncomfortable atmosphere. "Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. We're expecting some turbulence as we descend," the captain announced. The seatbelt signs lit up with a soft ding. Thomas put away the book he'd been reading and gazed out the window. Below, the sprawling city of Los Angeles was coming into view, a vast grid of streets and buildings stretching toward the ocean. He hadn't visited his son in nearly 6 months, too long, but their busy lives made regular visits difficult. As the plane dipped lower, cell service suddenly returned. Thomas's phone buzzed with incoming messages. He smiled as he scrolled through them, stopping at one from a contact named My Boy. After reading it, he pressed the call button. "Hey, son," Thomas said warmly, his deep voice carrying just enough to be heard by those nearby. "Yes, I'll be landing soon, about 15 minutes. "No, don't worry about picking me up yourself. You've got that important meeting. The studio car is fine. I'm not too proud to be chauffeured around." He chuckled softly. Patricia was collecting trash one final time before landing when she overheard this snippet of conversation. She slowed her pace, lingering near Thomas's row. "The screenplay reading tomorrow?" "Of course I'll be there," Thomas continued. "I wouldn't miss it. Yes, I packed the suit you sent. Don't worry about the hotel. The presidential suite is too much, but I appreciate it." The businessman sitting next to Thomas couldn't help but join the conversation after Thomas ended his call. Sounds like you've got quite a welcome waiting, he remarked. Thomas nodded modestly. My son likes to make a fuss when I visit. He forgets I'm perfectly happy with simple things. What does your son do in LA? The man asked, clearly intrigued. He makes movies, Thomas replied simply, but with undeniable pride in his voice. Started small with independent films about 10 years ago. Now he's directing those big action pictures that the young folks line up for. The businessman's eyebrows shot up. Wait, is your son who I think? That new blockbuster that came out last month? The one with all the special effects and the famous actor who does his own stunts. Thomas nodded, his eyes twinkling. That's my boy's work. Patricia nearly dropped the trash bag she was holding. She stood frozen in the aisle, connecting the dots. That movie had been everywhere. Billboards, TV commercials, talk shows. It had broken box office records its opening weekend. Must be something, having a famous Hollywood director for a son, the businessman said, clearly impressed. He's still just my son, Thomas replied softly. Same boy who used to make little movies with his action figures in the backyard. I'm proud of him not because he's famous, but because he worked hard and stayed true to himself. The woman across the aisle joined in. My daughter saw that movie 3 times already. The director's been all over the news lately. Wasn't he just named one of the most influential people in entertainment by that big magazine? Thomas nodded humbly. He was. Though he'd tell you it's all just noise. He cares most about telling good stories. Patricia stood paralyzed, her mind racing. The magazine cover the woman mentioned had been in her own bag just days ago. She'd read the feature article about the brilliant young director who'd revolutionized action films, who was known for his outspoken views on social justice, who had started a foundation supporting veterans after being inspired by his father's military service. His father, who was a decorated veteran. His father, who flew to visit him regularly. His father, who Patricia had just spent the past 6 hours deliberately mistreating. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, jolting Patricia from her stunned realization. She stumbled slightly, grabbing a seat back to steady herself. When she looked up, her eyes met Thomas. He gave her a small, knowing smile, not unkind but aware. In that moment, Patricia knew that she had finally made the connection. The plane continued its descent, but Patricia felt as though she was in free fall. Welcome to Los Angeles. Local time is 2:15 p.m., and the temperature is a pleasant 75 degrees, the captain announced as the plane touched down with a gentle bump. The passengers erupted into the usual chorus of seatbelt clicks and rustling as they prepared to disembark. Thomas remained seated, in no rush to join the pushing and shoving in the aisles. Patricia stood near the front of the plane, her face pale as she mechanically thanked departing passengers. Her eyes kept darting toward Thomas's row. Looks like we've got a welcoming committee, said the businessman next to Thomas, pointing through the window. On the tarmac below, near a private airport entrance, stood a small group of people in professional attire. One man held up a sign that simply read, Mr. Wilson. Thomas smiled. My son always insists on the VIP treatment, no matter how many times I tell him I'm fine taking a taxi like everyone else. When most passengers had filed out, Thomas finally stood, collecting his veteran's cap and carry-on bag. As he made his way toward the exit, Patricia suddenly stepped forward, blocking his path. Sir, she began, her voice catching. I wanted to apologize for earlier. My behavior was inexcusable. Thomas looked at her calmly. We all have bad days, he said simply. Take care now. He moved past her and down the jet bridge, leaving Patricia staring after him, the words she'd rehearsed for the last 20 minutes dying on her lips. Thomas emerged from the terminal into the bright California sunshine. The small group spotted him immediately. A young woman in a sleek pantsuit stepped forward. Mr. Wilson, welcome to Los Angeles, she said professionally. I'm Lisa from the studio. We have a car waiting to take you to the hotel. Thank you, Lisa, Thomas replied with a warm smile. My son always makes such a fuss. It's no fuss at all, sir. Director Wilson was very clear about making sure you were taken care of. As they walked toward the exit, Patricia emerged from the terminal. Her shift had ended, and she was rolling her small crew suitcase behind her. She stopped short when she saw Thomas with the studio representatives. Through the large windows, a black SUV with tinted windows and a studio logo on the door waited at the curb. A driver in a suit stood beside it, ready to open the door. Patricia inched closer, unable to tear herself away from the scene unfolding before her. She watched as Thomas chatted amiably with the studio representatives, his dignified bearing so different from how she had perceived him on the plane. Suddenly, the terminal doors slid open, and a tall, well-dressed man in his 30s burst through, flanked by two assistants rapidly talking into their phones. "Dad," he called out, his face breaking into a wide smile. Thomas turned, his own face lighting up. "There's my boy." The two men embraced warmly, the younger one clapping his father on the back. Even from a distance, Patricia could see the striking resemblance between them, the same strong jawline, the same expressive eyes. "Sorry I couldn't wait," the younger Wilson said. "The meeting ended early, and I wanted to see you right away." As they pulled apart, several travelers in the terminal began to whisper excitedly. A few pulled out their phones to snap pictures. One bold fan approached with a movie ticket stub. "Director Wilson, I love your film. Would you mind signing this?" The young director smiled graciously and signed the stub while his father looked on with quiet pride. Then another fan approached and another. Within minutes, a small crowd had gathered. From her spot near the wall, Patricia felt her stomach drop. The man's face was now unmistakable. She had seen it countless times in entertainment news and magazine covers. He was Anthony Wilson, the director whose film had just crossed the billion-dollar mark worldwide, whose name was on every Hollywood shortlist, whose outspoken views on equality and veterans' rights had made him a media darling. And she had shoved his father. A security guard appeared, politely dispersing the growing crowd of fans. "Let's get you both to the car," he said to the Wilsons. As they walked toward the exit, Anthony kept his arm around his father's shoulders, listening intently as Thomas spoke. Just before they reached the doors, Thomas paused and glanced back, his eyes finding Patricia's across the terminal. There was no anger in his gaze, no triumph or vindication, just a calm acknowledgement. He gave her a small nod before turning back to his son and continuing toward the waiting car. Patricia stood frozen, watching as father and son climbed into the luxury SUV, which then pulled smoothly away from the curb. Only when it disappeared from view did she finally move, sinking onto a nearby bench as the full weight of what she had done, and who she had done it to, came crashing down on her. Patricia barely slept that night. Her small apartment, usually a sanctuary after long flights, felt like a prison as she paced from room to room. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Thomas's face, not angry or upset, just looking at her with that calm dignity that now felt like a silent judgment. Her phone buzzed at 7:30 a.m. It was a text from her supervisor, meeting at headquarters, 10 a.m. sharp. Urgent. Patricia's heart sank. In 15 years of flying, she'd never been called to headquarters for an urgent meeting. She knew exactly what this was about. She showered and dressed with trembling hands, choosing her most professional outfit, a navy pantsuit she usually saved for job interviews. As she applied her makeup, trying to hide the dark circles under her eyes, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a link from a coworker. "Is this you?" The link opened to a social media post from Anthony Wilson, already shared over 20,000 times despite being less than 12 hours old. There was no video, just a thoughtfully written message. "Yesterday, I was reminded that the battle for respect and dignity never ends. My father, who served this country for 30 years and raised me alone after my mother died, was physically pushed and then ignored on his flight to visit me. This happened not because of anything he did, but because of how he looked. I'm not naming the airline or the employee because this isn't about punishment, it's about growth and change. But I am asking everyone to consider how we treat each other, especially those who have given so much for our freedom. #respect all veterans, #doing better." The comments section overflowed with support, many from other veterans sharing similar experiences. Several comments mentioned seeing the incident firsthand, with one passenger writing, "I was on that flight. The flight attendant's behavior was shocking. Your father handled it with incredible grace." Patricia felt sick. She closed the app and called a rideshare to take her to the airline headquarters. The modern glass building loomed above her as she walked through the entrance. At the reception desk, she gave her name with a dry mouth. "Yes, Ms. Reynolds, 14th floor, conference room C. They're expecting you." The elevator ride felt endless. When the doors opened, the head of flight crew operations was waiting. "Patricia," she said, her face unreadable. "This way." Patricia followed her down a hallway, past curious eyes peeking from offices. The conference room door opened to reveal not just her direct supervisors, but the airline's vice president of customer relations and 2 people from the legal department. "Please, sit down," the vice president said, gesturing to a lone chair facing the group. Patricia sat, her legs feeling like jelly. "I assume you know why you're here," he continued. "We've received 17 formal complaints about your behavior toward a passenger on yesterday's Atlanta to Los Angeles flight." "I can explain," Patricia began. "Several passengers recorded the initial incident during boarding," he interrupted, turning a laptop toward her. "We'd like you to watch." Patricia stared in horror as the screen showed her shoving past Thomas, the impact stronger than she remembered. The camera angle clearly showed his veteran's cap and his wince of pain as he steadied himself. Worst of all was the dismissive comment she'd made, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. When the video ended, the room fell silent. "That's not who I am," Patricia whispered, tears threatening. "Unfortunately, Ms. Reynolds, actions speak louder than words," the legal representative said. "And your actions continued throughout the flight. Multiple witnesses reported that you deliberately ignored this gentleman's requests and provided substandard service. We've also learned," the VP added, "that the passenger in question is Thomas Wilson, father of film director Anthony Wilson." "I didn't know who he was when." "That's precisely the point," the VP cut in sharply. "It shouldn't matter who he is or who his son is. He was a customer and a veteran who deserved respect." Patricia stared at her hands. "Am I fired?" The head of flight operations sighed. "That's what we need to discuss. Director Wilson's post specifically mentioned not wanting punishment but growth. He's given us an opportunity here, despite what happened." "The airline is facing significant public relations damage," the VP explained. "Director Wilson has over 5 million followers, and his post has already been viewed by more than 1 million people. But strangely enough, he's been remarkably restrained. He hasn't named you or the airline." "We've reached out to him directly," the legal representative added. "He says his father just wants this to be a learning moment." Patricia looked up, surprised. "So I'm not fired?" "That depends," the VP said, leaning forward. "We have a decision to make about your future with this airline, and a lot depends on how you respond to this situation." Outside the window, planes took off and landed in the distance. Patricia's career, her life for the past 15 years, hung in the balance as she faced the consequences of a moment's thoughtlessness that had rippled far beyond what she could have imagined. 3 days after the meeting at airline headquarters, Patricia sat in her car outside Sunrise Studios, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She'd been sitting there for 20 minutes, gathering courage to walk through the gates. The airline's decision had been unexpected. They'd given her 2 options: immediate termination or a 6-month probation period during which she would help develop a new training program focused on respectful passenger treatment. The catch: she needed to personally apologize to Thomas Wilson and his son. "We can arrange a meeting, but you need to show genuine remorse," her supervisor had told her. "This isn't about saving your job anymore. It's about doing what's right." A security guard approached her car, tapping on the window. "Ma'am, can I help you?" Patricia rolled down her window. "I'm Patricia Reynolds. I have an appointment with Anthony Wilson at 11. The guard checked his tablet. "ID, please." After verifying her identity, he pointed toward a sleek glass building. "Park in the visitor section. Someone will meet you at the entrance." Patricia found a spot and checked her appearance one last time in the rearview mirror. She looked tired, the past few days of stress etched on her face. Taking a deep breath, she walked toward the building. A young woman with a clipboard waited at the door. "Ms. Reynolds? I'm Diane, Director Wilson's assistant. Please follow me." They entered a modern lobby filled with movie posters. Patricia recognized Anthony Wilson's name on many of them. They took an elevator to the top floor, where Diane led her down a hallway lined with awards and photos. "Wait here," Diane said, gesturing to a seating area outside a large office. "Director Wilson will be with you shortly." Left alone, Patricia noticed a framed photo on the wall. Thomas Wilson in his full military dress uniform, standing proudly next to his son at what appeared to be a film premiere. The contrast between the dignified man in the photo and how she treated him on the plane made her stomach clench with shame. The office door opened. Anthony Wilson stood there, tall and serious in casual business attire. Up close, his resemblance to his father was even more striking. "Ms. Reynolds," he said, his voice neither warm nor cold. "Please come in." Patricia entered a spacious office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the studio lot. To her surprise, Thomas was there too, seated in a leather chair by a small conference table. "Mr. Wilson," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't expect to see you here." Thomas nodded but said nothing. Anthony gestured for her to sit. "My father wanted to be present for this conversation. I hope that's all right." Patricia sat down, her rehearsed apology suddenly inadequate in the face of both men. "I want to say how deeply sorry I am for my behavior on the flight. There's no excuse for how I treated you, Mr. Wilson." Thomas studied her face. "You know, when I was in the service, I faced a lot worse than a rude flight attendant. That push didn't hurt my body nearly as much as it hurt my dignity." Patricia felt tears threatening. "I know, and I'm so sorry." "What I don't understand," Anthony cut in, his voice controlled but tight with emotion, "is why. My father is one of the kindest people you'll ever meet." He was minding his own business, trying to put away his bag. "What made you target him?" The direct question hung in the air. Patricia had asked herself the same thing countless times over the last few days. "I'd like to say I was just having a bad day," she admitted. "But that's not the full truth. I made assumptions based on, I don't even know, his age, his race, the fact that he was moving slowly. None of these are excuses. They're just ugly truths about biases I didn't even realize I was carrying." Thomas leaned forward. "At least you're being honest now." "The thing is," Patricia continued, finding her voice, "I've spent days thinking I was going to lose my job because of who you are, because your son is famous. But that's just another wrong assumption, isn't it? I should be facing consequences because of who I am and what I did, not because of who you are." Anthony and Thomas exchanged a look. "That's the first sensible thing you've said," Anthony noted. "My father taught me that power and influence should be used to create positive change, not for revenge. That's why I didn't name you or the airline in my post." Thomas spoke up. "My son tells me the airline is considering having you help develop some kind of training program." Patricia nodded. "If you're both okay with that. Otherwise, I'll be terminated, which I'd probably deserve anyway." "Punishment doesn't teach nearly as well as responsibility does," Thomas said quietly. "What would this program involve?" For the first time since entering the room, Patricia felt a tiny spark of hope. She outlined the proposal she'd been developing, training that would address unconscious bias, respectful treatment of all passengers, and special considerations for elderly travelers, veterans, and people with disabilities. As she spoke, the atmosphere in the room shifted subtly. The tension didn't disappear, but it transformed into something more productive. 6 months later, Patricia stood in front of a room filled with airline employees. Her hands weren't shaking anymore when she spoke to crowds, not after doing this twice a week for half a year. "So that's why language matters," she explained, pointing to the presentation screen behind her. "It's not about being politically correct, it's about showing basic human respect." 50 flight attendants, pilots, and ground crew members watched attentively. This wasn't just another boring company training. Patricia's sessions had gained a reputation for being honest, practical, and genuinely moving. "Before we wrap up today, we have a special guest," Patricia announced, trying to keep her voice steady. "Someone whose experience helped create this program in the first place." The door opened and Thomas Wilson walked in. He looked much as he had that day on the plane, but now he wore a crisp button-down shirt and carried himself with the same quiet dignity that had once intimidated Patricia but now inspired her. "This is Mr. Thomas Wilson," Patricia said, "a 30-year veteran of the Army and a man who experienced firsthand what happens when bias affects customer service." Thomas nodded to the group. "Thank you for having me." For the next 15 minutes, Thomas shared his story, not just about the incident with Patricia, but about a lifetime of small moments where he'd been judged, ignored, or mistreated. He spoke without anger or bitterness, just straightforward truth. What made that day different, Thomas concluded, wasn't that it happened. It was that someone was willing to learn from it. After the session ended and the room cleared out, Patricia and Thomas sat together at the conference table. "That's the last official training session," Patricia said. "The airline is implementing the program across all their hubs starting next month." Thomas smiled. "How does it feel?" "Strange," Patricia admitted. 6 months ago, I thought my career was over. Now the CEO is talking about making me the permanent head of the training division. You earned it. You took a bad situation and turned it into something positive." Patricia shook her head. "You and your son did that. You could have destroyed me online. One word from Anthony, and I would have been the most hated person on the internet." "Punishment doesn't create change," Thomas said simply. "Responsibility does. I learned that in the army, and I taught it to my son." Outside the window, a plane took off, climbing steadily into the blue sky. "I have something for you," Patricia said, reaching into her bag. She pulled out a small box. "It's not much, but I wanted you to have it." Thomas opened the box to find a silver pin shaped like an airplane wing. Inside the lid was a small card that read, "To remind you that change is possible, even at 30,000 feet." "Thank you," Thomas said, genuinely touched. Patricia's phone buzzed. She glanced at it and her eyes widened. It's the airline's PR department. Anthony's post from 6 months ago just hit 1 million shares online. His new movie comes out next week, Thomas explained. People are revisiting the story. Has he mentioned all this in his interviews? Thomas nodded. He's been talking about the training program you developed. Apparently, 3 other airlines have already reached out about implementing similar training. Patricia sat back, overwhelmed. "When I shoved past you that day, I never imagined we'd end up here." "Life rarely takes us where we expect," Thomas replied. "The question is what we do when we arrive." Later that evening, Thomas met his son for dinner at an upscale restaurant in downtown Los Angeles. The hostess led them to a private booth away from curious eyes. "How was the final training session?" Anthony asked after they ordered. "Powerful," Thomas said. "Patricia has really transformed the program. And herself, I think." Anthony nodded thoughtfully. The studio loved the documentary concept, by the way. They think a short film about bias, accountability, and change could be something special. "As long as you don't make me the star," Thomas chuckled. "I've had enough fame to last a lifetime." "Too late, Dad. You're already the star of this story." Across town, Patricia sat on her balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. Her phone pinged with a message from the airline CEO. "Board approved the permanent position. Training division is yours to lead. Congratulations." She smiled, thinking about how a simple moment, a thoughtless shove on an airplane, had changed everything. Not because of who Thomas was or who his son was, but because they had given her the chance to face her own biases and grow beyond them. The path forward wasn't perfect. Real change never happened overnight. But as she watched the planes taking off from the distant airport, Patricia felt something she hadn't expected to find in all of this: hope. Not just for herself, but for all the people who would board those planes and be treated with the dignity everyone deserves.